hear me without the mic? Is that okay? Okay,
Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Monica, Drew, Ed, Glazers, for having me here. Thank you all for showing up. I wanted to ask you, what do you guys hear about Iran in the news? Just throw it out, whatever you guys are hearing in the news. I'm hoping you guys are watching the news, reading the news. What are you hearing about Iran? Anything? Okay, nukes, great. That's a very big deal. The Iranian government is out to get nuclear weapons, and the United Nations, America, Israel, basically all of the Sunni Middle East is trying to stop that so it doesn't cause a nuclear buildup in the Middle East. What else do you guys hear? Did anyone see Argo? Okay, what do you guys think of it? Now, Argo, on one hand, was very historically inaccurate, and we're going to look at a lot of that history, but on the other hand, it did a really good job, at least imagery, showing what was going on in Iran in the late 1970s, early 80s, so we'll talk about that too. Anything else? Does anyone have any Iranian friends? Well, Los Angeles has one of the largest Iranian Jewish communities. It has one of the largest Iranian diaspora communities, and a lot of people don't realize that Iran is a country located more in Central Asia than it is in the Middle East, but what we see with Iran is that it has a majority of Shia Muslims, some Sunni Muslims, but it also has a very large minority of other religious traditions, specifically Jewish, Christian, and also a religion called Zoroastrianism. In this talk, I'm going to talk about the Iranian Jewish community, how they ended up in Iran, and at that point we'll call it Persia, and we'll talk about why you got that name change, and then we'll look at Iranian history. And I think for you guys this is so important because if you turn on the news, you see that Iran is a major player in world politics today. And as Americans, as global citizens, it's so important to really know what's going on in that country because we may or may not be engaged in a war over there again. So let's look at the history and begin to understand Iran a little. Okay, so I named this talk Tehrangeles after Los Angeles. Tehran is the capital city. And so Westwood Boulevard, or Westwood, near UCLA, has anyone been to that area? They call that area Tehrangeles because it has the largest community of Iranian expats. So what I wanted to do is basically give this talk through images and photographs, and a lot of them are very personal for me because this is actually my own family. And so in this picture over here, this is a picture of my great-grandmother, who you actually see right here, on her wedding day when she was 12 years old, which was very common at that time in Iran at the turn of the century, in 1910. Jews, Christians, Muslims, Zoroastrians, everyone was marrying their daughter off at that age, and we'll talk about why a little bit later. And as you see, my family's Jewish, but what do the women have on their heads? What do you guys see? What are they called? Does anyone know? It's actually not a burqa. It kind of looks like burqas are what they use in Afghanistan to cover their heads, but a burqa actually completely covers a woman's face. This is in Farsi, it's called a chador, or in Islam, or in Arabic, it's called a hijab, a head covering. Jews and Christians living under Muslim rule the women had to dress like Muslim women. They had to follow and abide the rules of Islam. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. So my grandmother, as a 12-year-old Jewish girl on her wedding day, had to dress, as you could see, like a Muslim woman. You couldn't tell the difference between her, a Muslim, or a Christian living in Persia at that time. Then we move on to this picture, which my grandmother then had, my great-grandmother had my grandmother here, who's also covering her head. The women who are not covering their head, well, it's because they're not women, they're little girls, and they haven't menstruated yet. Again, under Islamic rule, Jews and Christians had to abide by the rules of Islam. And then what ends up happening is that by 1925, a man takes over named Reza Pahlavi. He's called the Shah. Shah in Farsi means the king. And he decides to kick all the religious Shia clerics, all the imams, out of power, and he wants to modernize and secularize Persia. He changes the name to Iran, and we'll talk about why a little bit later. But one of the things he does is by 1936, the Shah makes it illegal for women to wear the head covering. You are forced to wear European clothes as a way of Europeanizing Iran. So here's a picture of my family by 1938. And yes, the faces are dark and Persian and Middle Eastern, but if you look at the clothes, this could be Berlin, this could be Paris, this could be anywhere in Western Europe during that time period. And then this is my family now. This picture was taken a couple of years ago. The same grandmother here is right over here, this woman's daughter. This is her daughter, her granddaughter, her great-granddaughter, and then her great-great-granddaughter. And this is what happens when you get married at 12 and have the first child at 14. You live to see 5 generations of children. So we'll go on and talk about all of this history. Now, the question is, how did Jews even end up in the Persian Peninsula? A lot of people have no idea that Jews even came from Persia, especially a lot of Ashkenazi Jews. Do you guys know what the meaning Ashkenazi and Sephardic means in regards to Judaism? Ashkenazi Jews are Jews coming from Eastern Europe. Is anyone Jewish here? Okay, so where's your family from?
Russia, Romania, Germany.
Okay, so Russia, Romania. So where do you think she is? Ashkenazi Jews are Jews from Eastern Europe. Sephardic Jews are Jews from Spain, Portugal, the Iberian Peninsula, and the Middle East. So I'm sorry, what's her name?
Kaylin.
Okay, Kaylin's parents are, or grandparents, great-grandparents are Romanian and German. So what is she, Ashkenazi or is she Sephardic? Ashkenazi, absolutely. Anyone else? Where's your family from?
Ukraine.
Okay, great. So Ukraine, you're also, but you look Sephardic. Maybe you're just really tan from spring break or something. So you're also Ashkenazi. My family's from Iran, so we're actually Sephardic, coming from the Middle East. It's very similar. It's just more like saying an Irish Catholic or an Italian Catholic. Religiously, it's the same, but culturally, there's different ways of practicing the faith. Well, Jews ended up in the Persian Peninsula in 722 BCE. Around 2,700 years ago, making it the oldest community of Jews in the diaspora, meaning outside of the land of Israel. How did they end up there? King Cyrus passes away. The 12 tribes of the Israelites can't agree on who's supposed to take over after him. They start having infighting. The Assyrians, Assyria at that point would be located near Mesopotamia, meaning currently Iraq. They want Jerusalem, as a lot of people want Jerusalem because of where it's geographically located. And so thus they conquer the tribes. The 2 tribes of Judah and Benjamin stay in Jerusalem, but the other 10 tribes were conquered. And what was so smart of the Assyrians is that when they would conquer people, they would take them and relocate them to other parts of the Near East. Why do you think they would do that? Why would they take people they conquered and relocate them to other parts of the world? Any ideas? Yes?
To integrate them better into like serving the Assyrian kingdom.
Okay, good. And also, so they wouldn't revolt against them. So now they're dispersed, they're in a diaspora, and they can't gather up and revolt against them. So you get Jews ending up in Persia that long ago. What ends up happening is that the Babylonians come into Jerusalem by 586 BCE, destroy the temple that Solomon built, causes the Jews to go into what's referred to as the first diaspora. They are dispersed all over the Middle East. By 539 BCE, King Cyrus of Persia, he conquers Jerusalem. Now, the thing about, has anyone ever heard about King Cyrus before? King Cyrus was an amazing king. He was very progressive. He practiced a religion called Zoroastrianism. And because of his religious beliefs, he didn't believe you had to conquer people, convert them, or anything like that. So he was really good to the Jews living in Persia. And he turned to the Jews and said, I'm going to let you go back to Jerusalem, because remember, now he controls Jerusalem. Rebuild your temple. I'm going to send 2 Persian Jewish prophets, Ezra and Nehemiah, and they are going to reteach Judaism to you guys because you lost all of it out in the diaspora. And go back to Jerusalem and rebuild your temple and be in the Holy Land. And a lot of the Jews went back to rebuild the temple, what later on becomes known as Herod's temple. But a lot of the Jews stayed in Persia because life for them was so good they didn't need to leave. So that says a lot about Jews under the Persian Empire. In a sense, that's where my family comes from, going all the way back to 2,700 years ago. Over here we have an image of the Cyrus cylinder. Not beautiful, not really interesting to look at, but one of the most important documents that we have in history. The reason why this is so important is actually found by the British in the 19th century. It dates all the way back to the 5th century BCE. This is written in Akkadian, a dead language from that time period. What is the Cyrus cylinder talking about? Universal human rights. It's talking about religious pluralism, allowing people to practice their faith, having human rights. For the Jews, this was incredibly important. While Jews are not specifically mentioned in the Cyrus Cylinder, it is because of his beliefs in human rights that the Jews were able to live a good life in the Persian Empire. The United Nations in New York has a replica of the Cyrus Cylinder because for them, this is what they base their UN Declarations of Human Rights on. So for a king from 2,700 years ago, you can imagine how unbelievably progressive he was to believe in universal human rights. For a king now in the Middle East, you don't even see that type of belief. So for him to have it was very important. The Jews loved King Cyrus. He's the only non-Jewish king discussed in the Hebrew Scriptures as being a Messiah. Not the Messiah, but a Messiah meaning like an anointed leader. That's how much they loved him because of what he granted them. Now, Islam comes into being in the 7th century. By 638, Muslims raided and conquered Persia from the Persian Empire. Now, people found themselves in Persia living under Muslim rule. How were Jews and Christians treated under Islamic rule? As Islam begins, Islam is a proselytizing religion. What does proselytizing mean? Can anyone tell me? Any ideas, you guys? Yes?
To go out and spread the word.
Okay, great. To actively seek converts. So as Islam goes out and seeks converts and begins to conquer countries, Jews and Christians now found themselves for the first time under this new religious tradition. And the question that was asked to the Muslim leaders, specifically Imam Umar, is, well, how do we as Muslims see the Jews and Christians? Jews and Christians are given a special status under Islamic belief. They are called dhimmis, D-H-I-M-M-I. Because Jews and Christians are also a monotheistic faith, Muslims give them what is referred to as second-class citizenship. We will protect you because you are people of the book being a monotheistic religion, but in return you have to accept that you're inferior to a Muslim. You are a second-class citizen. You could practice your faith, we will not interfere with your faith, but you can't build your church or your synagogue higher than a mosque. You can't dress better than a Muslim. Little silly rules like that. But most importantly, you can practice your faith and we will protect you. You have to, in return, pay a special tax called the jizya tax that Muslims don't have to pay, the Jews and Christians have to pay, and thus you could live your life. Also, you have to abide by the rules of Islam. No alcohol, women have to cover themselves up. By the way, you guys, an interesting note, what was a profession that Jews had across the Middle East and in Muslim lands? They were bootleggers. They illegally made alcohol because under Islamic rule, you can't drink alcohol. People like their alcohol. They didn't want to get rid of it, so the Jews were the ones who would illegally make it and then sell it to the Muslims, all throughout Iran, Iraq, Egypt, etc. So Jews had what was referred to as dhimmi status, and dhimmi status depended on each country you lived in. For example, if you were a Jew or a Christian living in Andalusia in southern Spain, I don't want to over-romanticize it, but dhimmi status was pretty good. And as bad as second-class citizenship could sound to us, you have to understand that Jews living under dhimmi status in the Middle East was a lot better than the way they were being treated under Christian Europe and anti-Semitism there. But we're going to see a lot of that changes for the Jews when Shia Islam, a different branch of Islam, 80% of the Muslim world is Sunni, about 10% is Shia. The only dominant Shia country in the world today is Iran. The rest of the Muslim world is predominantly Sunni. Persia, and I'm going to use Persia and Iran interchangeably, and we'll talk about the difference a little bit later. Persia becomes Shia in the 16th century. So all Persians then who are Muslim go from Sunni Islam to Shia Islam. Are you guys familiar with the difference between Sunni and Shia? It's not like saying an Ashkenazi Jew and a Sephardic Jew, but it's like saying a Protestant and a Catholic. Similar religious traditions, but they have different theological ways of believing in it. Now, Shia Islam becomes the official state religion of Persia, and they have a very different concept of dhimmi status. Now, what you see is that Shias were obsessed with concepts of purity and impurity. And even if you were a Sunni Muslim, you were considered to be impure according to Shia Muslims. So now Jews and Christians go from being second-class citizens in Persia to a whole new category, where Jews and Christians are placed in the same category for Shia Muslims as dogs, pigs, and feces. They're considered to be literally impure. if a Shia Muslim touches a Jew, their body would be considered ritually impure. The Persian word for that is nejasat. What did that mean? Jews were forced to live in what's referred to as the mahaleh, the Jewish ghettos. There was Jewish ghettos in every single Persian town. Wherever Jews lived, they had to live in the ghetto. My grandmother would tell me, you know, Muslims would throw dead animal carcass into the ghetto because a dead animal was equivalent to an impure Jew for Shia Muslims. If it would rain outside, Jews and Christians were not allowed to go out in the rain because if the water touched their body, well, if the water touched a Jew or Christian's body and got into the water system, what do you think would be the big deal about that? It would make a Muslim impure. So they couldn't go to the same bazaar and get the food because you couldn't touch the food. It would make a Muslim impure. You couldn't drink from the same drinking fountains. All of these rules began to develop. Ironically, so what were the jobs and the professions that the Jews had? Ironically, they were artisans. A lot of them made artwork. They were involved in making fabrics and things like that because Shia Muslims saw these as impure jobs because it would stain your hands, you know, the dyes and stuff, so they didn't want to touch those jobs, so the Jews were the ones who had those jobs. They were also musicians because under Shia Islam, any music that wasn't religious music was considered to be sacrilegious and blasphemous. Persians loved their music and they loved their poetry. They weren't willing to let go of that because the Shia Muslim clerics told them to. So they would turn to the Jews and say, okay, well, you perform the music for us and you recite the poetry. In a sense, the Jews of Persia were the African Americans of American history. You come in through the back door, you perform, and you leave through the back door. So the Jews would come to Shia Muslim houses, they would perform the music, they would recite the poetry, and poetry is a huge deal in Persian culture. And then they would go back home. Remember, they weren't allowed to touch their food or anything like that, their tea, and then they would go back to the Jewish ghetto. These are some images of the Jewish ghetto in Tehran where the Jews were relegated to living. Very dirty, as you can imagine, because of the concept that they were impure. So junk, trash, everything from the outside non-Jewish world would be thrown into the Jewish ghetto. And this is a synagogue in Tehran. All of this has been torn down. Iran has experienced a major population boom. There's about 80 million people who live in that country. And so all of this has been torn down in order to build high-rise apartments and things like that. These are Iranian men at the synagogue in Tehran in the Jewish ghetto. And if you look at the way they dress, they're dressed just like a Muslim man. You can't tell the difference. But Jews were forced to wear a star on their clothing so people knew that they were Jewish and to make sure that they didn't have any physical contact with them. And remember, this is hundreds of years before Hitler made the Jews do that. Now, for the sake of time, we'll go through this quickly. Customs and traditions, like most ethnic communities and cultural communities, lots of parties, lots of traditions based on the rules of the Torah, and traditions based on what Muslims were doing. So they would take a holiday that the Muslims were observing, such as Nowruz, which is the spring equinox, the new year for Persians. It just passed for us. And the Jews would also observe that, as did the Muslims, the Zoroastrians, and the Christians, but they would then add their own Jewish twist to it. The evil eye. Who comes from a culture where the evil eye is a big deal? Where are you from?
I'm from Azerbaijan.
Oh, okay, you know it as well as I do. Okay, great. Anyone else? Yes?
I'm from Greece.
From Greece? Okay, great. So you guys have evil eyes all over. Absolutely. Anyone else? Who wants to explain what the evil eye is? Do you want to explain what you were brought up with the evil eye, what that concept is?
Yeah, just basically as a kid, you wear it so no one can put like a bad luck on you, because we believe that certain people have the ability to, you know, without knowing it, bestow some type of bad luck on you.
Okay, great. So the big thing was that parents, especially mothers, and this is what my book is about, I have just lots of pages alone on all these rituals Persian Jewish women would do to ward off the evil eye from their children, from their husbands, from their loved ones, because that's what the matriarch does. The evil eye, and you explained it very well, it's as if it's this negative energy around you that could cause harm. And it could even be if someone says, oh, your daughter is so beautiful, and you're thinking what she's really saying is, oh, your daughter's so beautiful, I hope a mirror falls on her face or something like that. You know, so it's these negative thoughts and you want to protect them. The evil eye is a very real entity in Persian culture. All religious traditions within Persia practice it and try to repel it, as we see all over the world. And for Persian Jews especially, it's a very big deal. bar mitzvahs are an Ashkenazi thing, an Eastern European Jewish thing. Who's been to a bar mitzvah before? Okay, Persian Jews don't have bar mitzvahs. They do now, but they didn't in Persia. It was not a popular thing at all. What the boys would do is they would go up and they would all say a prayer or read from the Torah, and that was it. It was a very mild party afterwards. It's not the affairs that you find in America now. Okay, betrothal and marriage. I love this picture. As heartbreaking as it is, I think this picture says so much. This picture was taken in 1875. It's a 9-year-old Persian Jewish bride on her wedding day. If you guys look at this picture, how can you tell this is her wedding day?
Jewelry.
Okay, great, the jewelry, wonderful. What else do you guys see? Just throw out whatever you see. I mean, do you think village girls look like that all the time, just running around their village? So what do you think, how do you look at this and say, oh, this girl's on her wedding day? What's this? The veil, absolutely. Remember, they were living under Shia Muslim rule, so this is the way they had to have their veils. I have a veil for my grandmother that's like this. It's absolutely beautiful because all of this is gold thread that you find on it. And the jewelry, you guys are absolutely correct. Look at all this beautiful jewelry that's on her. You see how her sleeves are awkwardly pushed up to show off her wedding jewelry? Now the jewelry has two purposes. Number one, to make her look beautiful, of course, to make her look older. She's 9 years old. Let's make her look older because it's her wedding day. But also, in a time when 9-year-old girls are getting married, according to Jewish law, rabbinic law, and this is the same thing for Muslims and Christians, it wasn't just the Jewish girls, everyone at this time was getting married at this age, her husband could be anywhere from a decade to 20 years older than her. He was not allowed to touch her until she started menstruating, 12, 13. And so for a 9-year-old girl to get married and to have her first child at 12, 13 years old, and then to have 1, 2, 3, 10 children like my grandmother did, it was a miracle for these women to survive. Not only for these women to survive, but for their children to survive in a time of a lack of scientific knowledge, know-how, medicine, etc. So this jewelry serves a whole other purpose. It's not only placed on her to make her look beautiful, but all of this jewelry is to ward off the evil eye. So like a necklace like this, the one that you see here, Jewish young girls and Muslim girls would wear. Inside they would have the scriptures from the Quran or from the Hebrew scriptures, and that again was to ward off the evil eye. I'm sorry for the people who are looking at it from this perspective on this wall, so you can't see it very well. She also has henna all over her hands. Again, henna is considered auspicious to ward off the evil eye. And then her eyes, she has eyeliner around her eyes. When I lived in India, I saw this a lot with babies too. It wasn't only to make her look beautiful. The eyeliner in Farsi is called surme, which is just literally kohl that they placed around her eyes. That again was to ward off the evil eye. And then, do you guys notice her eyebrows? Maybe I should say, ladies, do you notice her eyebrows? Because most men don't even notice this. But her eyebrows were really nicely tweezed and shaped. Persian women were not allowed to remove hair. The way Persian women would remove hair is by threading. They were not allowed to remove hair until they were getting married. So what would happen is this little girl would go to the hammam, the public bath, just for the women. She would go with all the women in her family and all the women in her groom's family. Remember, she's meeting him maybe 2 or 3 days before the wedding. And the women would come who would thread her. All the women would be singing, ululating. They would bring traditional ritual foods. And then her body would be threaded and all the hair would be removed and her eyebrows would be tweezed and nicely shaped. And then she would be ready for her wedding day. This was also the time where all the women on her groom's family had the opportunity to see her naked in order to make sure that there aren't any defects on her body. My book interviewed about 50 women who got married from this generation, because for me, these are the women who are the strongest. You're 9 years old, you are following such strict rules of ritual purity that the only men you're allowed to see or even be around is your father or your brothers. And then all of a sudden they're telling you, you have to now marry this guy you've never met before, who could be 19, 20, 30, and you have to leave your parents' home that you've never left before in your life to move in with him and his family. And I would ask these women, what was your life like? And they would tell me their life just depended on luck. If you were lucky enough to have your husband be good to you, and more importantly, if you were lucky enough to have who be good to you, who do you think? Not just their husbands, but if they're moving in with their husband's family, who do you think?
Their mother.
Their mother-in-law, absolutely. Because what would end up happening, and you guys, you see this in a lot of cultures, South Asia, East Asia, what would end up happening was that there was a hierarchy in the pecking order of matriarchs. The mother-in-law, in a sense, was the queen, then all of his sisters, and then all of the women who were who married into that family. So, if this little girl doesn't produce a son, she goes into that lowest pecking order and almost becomes a maidservant for her mother-in-law and all of her in-laws. And let's understand this. Why do you think it happens this way? And you see this throughout Middle Eastern cultures. I mentioned I saw it in India. You see it all over East Asian culture. I would then ask these women, well, what was your relationship like with your husband? You're 9 years old and you have this 20-something-year-old man. And a lot of them would say, you know, he was almost like my father. We would go to parties. I had a doll. I would fall asleep. He would wake me up, pick me up, and take me home. I learned to love him, but I didn't fall in love with him because that's not the way we learned about marriage. You don't fall in love with your spouse. You fall in love with who? Who do these women say they actually fell in love with? If it's not their husbands, who do you think it is? Their babies. Absolutely. I can read lips. You thought you didn't see that. Their babies. Absolutely. Especially their sons. Because remember, as much as they love their daughters, your daughter leaves you at 9 years old to move in with her husband and take care of your mother-in-law. When you are getting old and you're a widow, it is you move in with your son, not with your daughter, because she's taking care of her husband's mother, basically. So that's where that obsession with men, especially sons, comes from in Middle Eastern culture, because that's who these women would tell me really became like the love of their lives. It wasn't their husbands who were 15 years older than them and they just met them on their wedding day. It was their sons. And remember, a lot of times, their sons are maybe 13 years, 14 years younger than they are because they have them at such young ages. And we're not talking about an edible sexual love, but more of that attachment. And that's where that concept of the son became so important within Middle Eastern culture. Now, by 1936, as I mentioned, the Shah made it illegal to wear Persian clothing. So you can imagine this is what women used to dress like. And then this is what weddings became, because remember, he forced European clothing and culture onto the Persian people. Lots of parties. We'll skip this for the sake of time. Persians love to party. They'll find any excuse. A traditional wedding ceremony will take 7 to 6 days. Lots of exchange of gifts, jewelry, etc. A mikveh is where women immerse themselves after they finish menstruating within the Jewish tradition, and these are some mikvehs that you find in Tehran. But let's now look at the modern period. By 1925, you have the Pahlavi dynasty, and this is where you see America getting involved in Iranian politics. So let's look at this guy here. His name is Reza Shah, and remember, the Shah means king, so Reza Pahlavi. He, by 1925, takes over from Persia. He has a coup, and the only way he was able to succeed was that the British turned to him and said, you gain power. You kick out all of the religious Shia Muslim clerics from power, take their land. We will help you have power, modernize and secularize Persia and make it more European, and in return, you are going to give us Persia's what? Oil, absolutely. And in that way, Persia and the British had an exchange. So Reza Shah did exactly that. He modernized Iran. He secularized Iran. He turned to all the Muslim clerics and said, you're out of power. I'm going to take all of your land. And he really forced Europeanization on the Persians. He, like other leaders of the Middle East, take the side of Adolf Hitler and the Germans during World War II. The reason why the Middle Eastern leaders take the side of Hitler is because the biggest enemies of the Middle East at that time were the British and the French who were colonizing them, the Russians. And your enemy's enemy is your friend, and who is the Germans' enemies? The Russians, the British, the French, etc. And as a way of showing Hitler how much he is on his side and really bonds with the Germans, he then changes the name from Persia to Iran. What does Iran mean? Does anyone know? Aryan. 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, Persia was settled by Aryans coming from Central Asia, from Russia. We don't know why, if there was a war or famine, but they worked their way into what's referred to as the Indus Valley region, northern India. And over there, they settled India, became the Brahmins of the Hindu culture, and then they worked their way into the Persian Empire. So Persia was founded by Indo-Aryans, and this man, as a way of showing Hitler, I'm on your side, I'm going to change the name of my country that has been this name for 2,500 years from Persia to Iran in order to invoke the Aryan spirit of my people. Now, the Allied powers, thank God, World War II is over, and I say thank God because my family would have been on their way to the concentration camps because that's the pact that he made with Hitler. World War II is over. The Allied powers kick Reza Shah out of power, and who do they put in power instead? His son, Mohammad Reza Shah. He takes power in 1941. He has this playboy image. He's in his early 20s, completely secular, educated in all these posh schools in Switzerland, etc. And the Americans and the British turn to him and say, you come in, we'll support you, and in return you give us what? Oil, absolutely. So he continues on with his father's secularization policies, modernization. He really he wanted to turn Tehran into a little Paris, and he really did. My parents grew up under him, going to discos, going to bars, wearing bikinis, etc. So they were very secular. Now these guys were very important for the Jews because they turned to the Jews and said, we see ourselves in the lineage of King Cyrus. We could care less what religion you are, as long as you show loyalty to us and you work for the greater good of Iran. So they turned to the Jews, they said, come out of the Jewish ghettos, and before you know it, the Jews of Persia become one of the fastest growing, economically successful communities. And they begin to assimilate and acculturate into Persian secular society. This is his family. Basically, every American president had a good relationship with the king, with the Shah of Iran, because we were so heavily dependent on them for oil. Now, the beginning of the end for him was in 1973. The Shah has this massive party at Persepolis, which is the desert. He's celebrating 2,500 years of the rule and reign of King Cyrus. He wants to eradicate the Muslim history of Persia and bring in that secular history of King Cyrus. 1973, he has this massive party at Persepolis. By conservative standards, it cost $20 million in 1973. Most people said it cost $120 million. This is a time where the country is living in dire poverty, where there's rapid inflation. The wealthy is only getting wealthy and the poor are only getting poor. And, of course, ironically, you're having a massive party to celebrate 2,500 years of Persian rule, and you don't really invite a single Persian to the party. Elizabeth Taylor was invited. The Queen of England was invited. Very few Persians were there to celebrate their own history and culture, showing people how much this man was really in love with European culture, American westernization, etc. I mean, things that they spent their money on. You can imagine if Queen Elizabeth is going to come to the deserts of Persia, the amount of money they spent to get rid of rattlesnakes and scorpions, because you can't have her get bit by I mean, so they erected this tent city, air-conditioned, the best vodka, the best, caviar you can imagine. And they televise this, and you have 80% of the population who are Shia religious Muslims, who are poor, and they're watching this going, we hate this guy. On top of that, by 1963, he has what's referred to as the White Revolution. You have to